Yeah, I'm convinced Lars really likes me because not only did I get the coveted after lunch slot, but I got the pleasure of speaking to you about policy and policy interventions. And the real joy of that comes from knowing that at least probably 75 to 80% of you have something about policy in your job descriptions. And so really you're all already experts in policy. What I wanted to do is, because I'm kind of setting the tone for the policy discussion, was just talk a little bit about all of the myriad of definitions that people bring to understanding policy. And from my experience working primarily interdisciplinary, in an interdisciplinary fashion, in a number of different projects, it's probably one of the words that will trip people up the most and will cause the most tension, because somebody will be talking about policy and somebody else will think that they're completely have no idea what they're talking about and that they're wrong and somebody else is right, because it's a word that's very malleable and that can be used in a lot of different senses. And certainly, you know, in a day-to-day government context, it has a certain kind of meaning, and in another context, it has other meaning. So what I wanted to start this presentation by doing was giving you not my own definition, but a definition of public policy. And it's one that I think is really important to remind people of, because policy is really where the rubber hits the road. Public policy is, of course, government policy. We have policy in the private sector, but this is public policy, and we're talking about, you know, what shapes the public agenda. It can be government, it can be governance, where the government plays a role as well. So designing solutions to real-world problems, which is, of course, why policy is exciting and interesting, and presenting value-driven arguments. And it's that point that it's about values that is the kind of the definition I wanted to bring to the table today. You can have other definitions, but I'm hoping it's helpful today to start to think about the value and the normative nature of public policy. So really, you can see Vickers, and I think Bob talked about public policy as the art of judgment. And it's really making a judgment between what is and what ought to be. So again, we have this idea of reality judgments, you know, what the current state of either the ecosystem, the watershed, whatever, the social system, and value judgments about what ought to be. And that leads us to then try to have actions that change the way that we currently govern ourselves, or the way that we manage the incentives we make towards changing people's behavior for the disincentives. So it's about behavioral change in order to reach this new, what ought to be, this vision of how we would prefer to be organized. And again, when we speak about policy, another real challenge is that we use it in a myriad of different ways, and we talk about policy in a certain sense very legitimately as being very specific. So hiring policy, human relation policy, all these things, very specific use of the term policy, which is, of course, a completely legitimate use. But if you look on the slide, I think it's helpful to remember that we use the same word to talk either about very narrowly defined, clear, smaller scale issues, and we use the same word to go the other end of the spectrum to talk about strategic analysis, strategic decision making, large scale social change, you know, ideological change. We talk about, you know, what are the policies that the government is putting in place in order to change the behavior of its citizens in the way that they are trying to have that behavior changed. So we can go all the way from the very specific to the very large scale, and we can use the same word to do it. And so I just wanted to flag that. It's a scalar thing, really. When we talk about scale and policy, we can talk at very different scales. So in the public sector, where do our public values come from, public policy values? So let's say here we have the Prime Minister, and it could be the Premier.
He does kind of look like that.
The same setup. And basically, in 1 year, he gets information from the Privy Council office, which represents the bureaucracy. And that's what some people would refer to as the kind of area for evidence-based policy or evidence-based decision-making, for maybe rational thinking around issues that transcends changes in government. So there's 1 ear dedicated to listening to the best quality information and arguments that our bureaucracy, informed by all of the stakeholders who, for good or bad, influence the bureaucracy. But that's only 1 ear. And it's really important for all of us to always remember that the other ear is entirely dedicated to the political and to being re-elected and to representing, you know, the will of the people who elected. I am sort of stumbling over that, sorry. The Prime Minister. So you have the political side very strong in public policy. And so that, again, creates policies that are implemented that may not make sense. They may not have a rational basis. And I think one of the biggest failings of particularly academics who work in public policy is this misconception that it's rational. And so it's just important for us to always flag this normative side and this value-based side that is inherent to the policy process. So policy can be stated or unstated. You're not going to, if you're really trying to change behavior in a way that, you know, privileges certain groups over other groups, or, you know, implements an agenda that may not be that popular, you don't write it down. You don't write down, you know, this ideological change. But you create policies that promote that kind of behavior change in society that you want to see. But another big failing for people is trying to look down and see, what does the policy say? And there is no policy because it's not written down. But it's through the instruments of public policy, how they're designed, that you start to see what they're actually promoting and what they're not promoting. So policy is not always written down. That's important. Stated and unstated. And at the scale of, you know, we're talking large-scale public policy, a strategic direction for how we move forward. And it's about values and politics. So again, for the purposes of this discussion, just because we have experts in public policy and we have neophytes in public policy, I also wanted to differentiate between policy instruments and public policy. If policy is the direction that we want to go in, the instruments of public policy are what we use to get there. And so we use regulation, we use information and suasion instruments. So we publish reports and documents and policy briefs, and we try to get people to understand what the issues are. We use voluntary, or we encourage voluntary activity, stewardship activity. We can spend the government's money to support certain kinds of a direction that we're encouraging, market-based instruments, fees, taxes, etc. And regulation is only one instrument. People often think that regulation is the instrument of public policy. But in fact, not only nowadays, if you want to implement a new regulation, you actually have to go through a whole process of proving why every single other instrument doesn't work, you know, in order to get it right, because nobody wants more regulation. So there's a lot of different kinds of policy instruments. This is, again, I'm an academic, so it's a bit nerdy, and it's a terrible acronym, but it sticks in the head. But again, it's just this idea that we have, if we're thinking about how we implement public policy, if public policy is the direction that we want society to go towards, then these are the tools that we use to shape people's behavior with. So we can use information instruments, monitoring information. Watershed report cards are an example of a policy instrument to give information, to provide monitoring data, to sort of sway, have people understand the kind of system that we're trying to give them a certain interpretation of how watersheds operate and what they should be thinking about. Advice and exhortation, advertising, commissions and inquiry, standard setting. I'm just picking some of these that seem particularly relevant to thinking in the watershed context about how we frame why we have watershed organizations, what their role is, and what kind of tools are available to help promote. And certainly just that government reorganization. You know, we could be advocating for watershed-based governance in Canada, you know, I won't say instead of provinces, but we could layer, you know, a level of watershed organization. In France, the whole country is organized on a watershed basis with the basins of water basins. So reorganizing strategically is an instrument, but it has to be promoting that vision that says this kind of watersheds would be important, would add value to the Canadian society if we took them seriously. So when we talk about watersheds then, we have this idea that, you know, we all think about watersheds as the basin that we're in and the one that we bond with and the one that we understand, but size matters for public policy around watersheds. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And the kind of public policy that you would see at the sub-watershed level is different than the kind of strategic thinking that you have at the basin level which is different than what you have, say, for the Lake Winnipeg Basin or the Great Lakes, or the large basin systems. So again, that's a hierarchical thing, it's a scale issue, but the policies are different for managing the large basins than they are for the smaller size basins. And so later on in the day, as we talk about policies for implementing the kind of change that we're looking to see, we have to remember that it depends on the scale of about what we're talking about. And it's not just about land and water. In the work that we've been doing on watersheds and settings for health, we've thought a lot about what is the role of basin organizations in being active on the land and then able to deal with other issues like, say, West Nile, emerging diseases, maybe mountain pine beetle, I don't know. But if you're already active on the land, then you may be a good person to go to for other issues that are not necessarily hydrological, but are transient through the watershed. But if you have a watershed organization that's already organized with landowners, has the relationships, has the contacts, it might be a really valuable level of organization for other issues as they come through. So there are issues that transcend the watershed that may not even be watershed issues, but they still may be very well dealt with by a watershed group because of the contacts that they have. The other thing I just wanted to bring up, of course, is this idea that it is a big mess. It's a big, concurrent, constantly changing, nested hierarchy of drainage systems, all working together. And again, we like that language of Mel Falkenmark of the hydrological imperative, because we don't control the rain, we don't control the atmosphere, but we are